love your own enemies, don't be loving mine. My enemies are the theocratic fascists. I don't love them. I want to destroy them.
Child made in the image of God. Oh no, you're not. You're a faggot. And you can't join your church and you can't go to heaven. This is disgraceful. It's inhuman.
Hello. Okay, I know I said I was going to read the whole book, but I'm still hoping to read the shorter chapters, even if I do make a complete mess of it. This is from the book Nailed. 10 Christian Myths That Show Jesus Never Existed at All by David Fitzgerald. Myth number 4. Eyewitnesses wrote the Gospels. Yeah, they were right there. Yeah. People who actually walked and talked with Jesus, heard him speak, documented all the places that he went to while he was alive, actually saw him and heard him. Eyewitnesses wrote the Gospels. Yeah, that would make sense, because how else would anybody know what he said word for word so that they could put that in red ink in the Bible? Yeah. How would we know what Jesus's words were? How would we know what Jesus taught? How would we know where he went when? If, in fact, the people who were there at the time didn't write the Gospels. I mean, how could we possibly think that people who were born after he died would know any of this? You know, in my opinion, this chapter would be 3 or 4 words long. They were all born after his alleged death. Okay, that's more than 4 words. They were all born after his death. They weren't the people, if he lived, which I don't think he did. But assuming for just a second he did, these were not the people that walked and talked and went around the countryside with him. These were people born after he died. And nobody who did walk around with him while he was alive wrote a word down. Not what he said, not what he did, not what he taught, not where he went. So how could the Gospels be anything but fiction? So, sorry, just had to put that in there in case you don't feel like listening to me read this whole thing. But let's see what David Fitzgerald says about eyewitnesses wrote the Gospels. This is a quote from Justin Martyr, dialogue with Tripho, T-R-P-H-O, chapter 8. But Christ, if he has indeed been born and exists anywhere, is unknown and does not even know himself, and has no power until Elias came to anoint him and make him manifest to all. And you, having accepted a groundless report, invent a Christ for yourselves, and for his sake are inconsiderately perishing. I read that badly. I'm sorry. The 4 Gospels of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the only sources we have for biographical information on Jesus. 20 centuries of church-approved history have represented the Gospels as 4 independent, consistent, complementary, and thoroughly trustworthy eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life from his closest associates, cherished, preserved, faithfully and accurately handed down through the ages to today. But this official story has some serious credibility problems. There are 2 critical questions that need to be answered. Who wrote the Gospels and when? And why do Christians not ask this question? When were the Gospels written? A wide range of possible dates have been proposed over the years, running from a full century from the 50s all the way to the 150s and still later. Scholarship has somewhat fine-tuned this speculation. It's long been accepted that the Gospels were written after Paul's letters, which would put them after 58 CE. Furthermore, most mainstream scholars tend to place the earliest, Mark's Gospel, in the mid-70s, sometime just after the Jewish-Roman War, 66 through 70. This is because Mark contains unmistakable allusions to various events of the revolt, including the destruction of the temple in the year 70. There are still other reasons to date all of the Gospels later than the 70s or even the 90s. One is because of the pervasive silence of early Christian writers concerning them. Respected Christian biblical historian Bruce Metzer has gone into great detail surveying the consensus of scholars on the emergence of the New Testament in The Canon of the New Testament, Its Origin, Development, and Significance, Clarendon, 1987, and has uncovered some troubling facts. One of the first glaring non-references to the Gospels is in the first letter of Clement of Rome, written in c. 95 CE. Clement cited the Old Testament as Scripture over 100 times and frequently refers to Hebrews and some of Paul's letters, though he considers them as good counsel, not Scripture. But oddly, Clement never refers to any gospel. On 2 occasions he even quotes Jesus, but without ever referring to any written source, and these 2 quotes don't quite correspond to anything in our Gospels. Remarkably, this suggests that Clement, a prominent leader of the church in Rome, had no knowledge of them. The letter of, I'm sorry, I had to put my dog out. She was over there woofing, yeah, and so now she's outside to bark her head off, so okay, but she's happier, that's all that matters. The letters of Ignatius of Antioch, spelled Ignatius, written c. 107 CE, show that like Papias, P-A-P, or Papias, P-A-P-I-A-S, Ignatius appears to be very familiar with the letters attributed to Paul, but his knowledge of the Gospels is problematic. Some have suggested that he may have borrowed ideas and phrases from the Gospels, but all of these citations are conjectural. Not only does he not make any precise quotations, frustratingly, he never names his sources either, or even hints that he is citing a source at all. Matthew and Luke come later still. How do we know? Because both plagiarized from Mark. More than 200 years ago, Bible scholars noticed an interesting and quite incestuous relationship between the first 3 Gospels. Though there are major divergences between them, which is worrisome already, even the agreements between them are suspicious. The 3 share a truly astonishing number of near-identical passages, arranged in much the same order and in many cases using the exact same wording. Luke reproduces 50% of Mark's text, and Matthew a whopping 90%. Of the 661 verses in Mark's Gospel, Luke's Gospel uses about 360, and Matthew's Gospel uses about 607. The parallels are so widespread and apparent that the majority opinion among biblical authorities has been in agreement ever since, namely that Matthew and Luke base their material upon Mark's. If the Ferrer of Goodacre hypothesis are correct, and I believe Goodacre's modified Ferrer hypothesis is, Luke also copied from Matthew, while others speculate both use a hypothetical second source, Q. Matthew is not the only source Luke stole from. In Josephus and the New Testament, Hendrickson Publishers, 1992, Josephine scholar Steve Mason demonstrates that Luke copied from Flavius Josephus as well, but unfortunately not always accurately. In fact, Luke's mistakes in plagiarizing are one of the ways we know that he's copying from Josephus, and not the other way around. Where there are points of contact between them, the information Josephus provides is 1, more extensive, 2, much more detailed, 3, more accurate, and 4, in the correct context. For example, he knows exactly when and why the census under Quirinius happened, that the census was only of Judea and not the whole world, etc. By contrast, Luke's details on these same matters are sketchy and simplified, quite often wrong and unrelated to the story. They are merely tidbits that have been inserted into the narrative simply to provide window dressing and flourishes of authenticity. Luke is quite deliberately mining the works of Josephus for historical details he can use to give his gospel the appearance of a real historical work. He is fabricating history, not recording it. Incidentally, since Josephus wrote Antiquities of the Jews in the mid-90s, c. 93 or 94, this means the author of Luke could not have written his gospel before then, and it is more plausible that it was written much later. A date early in the 2nd century, or perhaps even as late as the 130s, would be a realistic estimate of its composition, along with the book of Acts, which Luke also wrote. The 4th gospel, John, was the last gospel to be written. Even conservatives allow that John may have written as late as the turn of the 1st century, citing one piece of physical evidence, the John Rylands papyrus, P52, a fragment about the size of a credit card. However, as A.N. Wilson notes, in spite of claims by journalists and non-papyrologists in recent times, it is difficult, if not impossible, to date papyrus within a 50-year margin. So the last gospel could date from nearly any time in the early to mid-2nd century. Who wrote the Gospels? Tradition lists the 4 evangelists as Matthew Levy, a tax collector and one of Jesus' 12 disciples; John Mark, the Apostle Peter's interpreter; Luke, Paul's personal physician, also said to have written Acts; and finally, the disciple whom Jesus loved, traditionally insisted to be the Apostle John, son of Zebedee. But this is sheer guesswork. Actually, all of the authors' names are sheer guesswork, or pious fraud. The titles, according to Matthew, etc., were not added until later in the 2nd century. All 4 Gospels were originally anonymous. None claimed to be written by eyewitnesses, and all contain giveaways that they were written generations later by well-educated Greek-speaking theologians, not illiterate Aramaic speakers. For instance, Luke's Gospel opens by telling us his story has been handed down to his generation, since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Luke 1, verse 1 through 2. Matthew occasionally lets it slip that he is writing long afterward, such as when he describes the Jewish authorities' cover-up of the resurrection. This saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day. Matthew 28, verse 15. And the story of the field of blood, wherefore that field was called the field of blood unto this day. Matthew 27, verse 8. There are other indications that make this even more... Okay, so I lost my page here. Okay, some acronyms in the Gospels. Historian Robert Price has noted several instances where the evangelists accidentally added elements to their stories that never could have occurred during the time they are depicting. Here are just a few of them. The story of the woman taken in adultery, John 8, 1 through 11. one of the most beloved passages from the Bible is a beautiful and truly timeless story of forgiveness. Let he who is without sin throw the first stone, with just the perfect dash of sex to spice it up. But it is completely fictitious. It was obviously written during the time when the early Jewish Christians had begun trying to decide which parts of the traditional Jewish law they would keep and which they would let go. As Price notes, no one in Jesus' time would ask Jesus whether we should obey the Torah or not. Compliance with Mosaic law was not an optional suggested serving of ethical advice. It was rigorously enforced. After all, that was what public stoning was for. Speaking of stones, we could call the Apostle Simon Peter Rocky, since that is what his nickname Cephas in Greek Petros meant. Matthew was Jesus making a pun when he tells Peter, "Upon this rock I will build my church," Matthew 16, verse 18. Though if this had happened in reality, Peter would have scratched his head and asked, "Say, Jesus, what's a church?" Since churches hadn't been invented yet, and wouldn't be developed until many decades later. Matthew gets ahead of his story, 10 verse 38, when he has Jesus tell his disciples, "He who does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me." An odd thing for him to say, since no one is supposed to have any idea that he is going to be arrested and crucified later on. But his disciples apparently let it go without any confusion or alarm, just as they do in John, when Jesus again blobs the end of the book. Therefore doth my Father love me, because I lay down my life, that I might take it again. John 10, verse. Incidentally, there's another odd thing about Jesus' speech here in Matthew that often goes unnoticed. Ostensibly, he is giving instructions to his 12 apostles to go out and start preaching, which they immediately do in the next chapter, Matthew 11, verse 1. And one chapter later, they are all together with Jesus again, Matthew 12, verse 1. Mark 6, verse 30, and perfectly fine, none of which would seem out of place if Jesus hadn't just told them that they were going out to be persecuted. 10, verse 22 through 23. But that pales in comparison to what else he says before they set out. For assuredly I say to you, you will not have gone through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Matthew 10, 23. The Son of Man is Jesus, of course, and his coming spells the end of the world. See Mark 13, verse 24 through 27. For details, the sun and moon darkening, the stars all falling, etc. Modern-day believers rationalize this failed prophecy by saying that Jesus was really talking to all of us in the audience. But his disciples would have had no way of knowing this message wasn't really directed at them. Besides, once you start rationalizing this much, aren't you already as good as admitting the gospel is nothing more than fictitious window dressing? And does anyone really think that Christian missionaries haven't gone through all the cities of Israel yet? And if Jesus really did say it, why didn't the world end around the year 30? No matter how one tries to twist this verse into something else, the fact remains that this prophecy of Jesus just doesn't hold up. Doesn't that make him a false prophet? The Gospels versus the Gospels. There are still plenty of other problems that kill any wishful notions of apostolic authorship. Matthew and Luke contradict each other in such critical details as the genealogy of Jesus, and thus both can't be right. And why would a real eyewitness like Matthew need to plagiarize the bulk of someone else's story, someone who wasn't an eyewitness, and just add a few little touches of his own here and there? And on the other hand, if Mark received his gospel from Peter, why is it that the other gospels have more anecdotes about Peter, including, for example, Jesus telling him, "You are Peter the rock, and upon this rock I will build my church"? Would Peter himself forget such an incident? It gets worse. Mark shows no understanding of the social situation in the Holy Land, making numerous errors that no one living in early first century Judea would have made. Interestingly enough, when you compare Matthew and Mark's Gospels, one finds that the author of Matthew is constantly correcting Mark's blunders about all aspects of Jewish society, religion, the calendar, holidays, customs, attitudes, even repeated misquotes. One last nail in this coffin is that whoever wrote the Gospel of Mark also demonstrates a George Bush-like lack of familiarity with Palestinian geography. No one who had actually lived in Palestine would have made the mistakes that the author of Mark does. For instance, as Earl Doherty observes, Mark 7:31 tells us Jesus departed from the region of Tyre, Tyre, and went by way of Sidon, Sidon, toward the Sea of Galilee, in the region of the Decapolis, a trip 50 miles out of his way on foot. This is one of several similar geographical blunders Mark makes. Meanwhile, though Luke appears very familiar with Rome's sites and taverns, which he occasionally mentions without any further explanation, not only does he not know much Aramaic, but he has little knowledge of Judea itself, since he blithely follows Mark's blunders as well, unlike Matthew, who corrects them. The earliest known appearance of John is among Gnostic circles. The Anchor Bible Dictionary cites many 2nd century Gnostic quotes from John. The earliest is a fragment dated sometime around 120 through 140, later quoted by Hippolytus. Certain church factions found it highly suspect and rejected it as heretical. To be fair, it's entirely likely that the original author was a Gnostic. But heretical or not, it proved to be so popular that it couldn't be repressed, despite the fact that it has virtually nothing in common with the teachings, theology, style, or even the context of the synoptics, which it often contradicts entirely. Like the other Gospels, there are indications that John has been re-edited and expanded. For example, in John 2:11, Jesus performs his first miracle. Then in verse 23, Jesus does more miracles. But after that, in 4 verse 54, Jesus does his second miracle. There are also 2 endings clumsily attached, including the story of the miraculous catch of fish, John 21 verse 1 through 11. In this Jesus fish story, if you will, he reappears to his disciples who have shrugged their shoulders and returned to being simple fishermen now that their Lord has been crucified. But when he miraculously fills their nets to bursting with 153 fish, they realize he has returned. As Price has seen, it's a bit absurd to picture them carrying on their inventory as usual if they have just realized their crucified master has risen from the dead. You fellows go have breakfast with the resurrected Son of God. I'll stay here and count the fish. But the real question is, why go out of the way to mention that there were exactly 153 fish? It's because this was the number of the fish in the original story. In that Greek story, our hero, the philosopher Pythagoras, Pythagoras, a strict vegetarian, bets the fishermen that if he can correctly guess the number of the fish in their nets, they will let them go free. Of course, he gets it right, just like in Jesus' story some 500 years later, there are exactly 153 fish. 153 just happened to be a sacred triangular number to the ancient Pythagoreans. Finally, if there remains any doubt as to whether close associates of Jesus wrote the gospel, remember that considering the average lifespan of the time, Any contemporaries of Jesus would have been long dead by the time the Gospels began to be written in the late 1st and early to mid-2nd centuries. So we have no way to know who or how many really wrote the Gospels, and can only guess when or where or how many times they've been edited and re-edited. Still, despite all that, could there still be real historical information preserved in them? Just what do the Gospels have to say about who Jesus really was? For further reading, Richard Carrier, The Problem of Luke's Methods as a Historian, in Not the Impossible Faith, pages 173 through 187. Or Steve Mason, Josephus in the New Testament, Hendrickson's Publishers, 1992. So that's the end of, myth number 4. So again, the Gospels were written quite a long time after Jesus' supposed death. So where did they get their information from? If not a single person alive, no historian or commentator, Jewish or Roman, no historian alive during Jesus' time, no witnesses alive during Jesus' time, wrote down a single thing about him. And we already know that lots of people were writing a lot of things during the 1st century. Not one word written about Jesus. Decades after his death, people come along and write the Gospels. How do they know what he said, or what he did, or where he went, or what his teachings were? How would they know? Sorry, the Gospels are fiction. I say this because I have read enough to make me believe it. And what I love about Nailed, this book by David Fitzgerald, is he pretty much has gone through some of the best stuff that I've written in other books and harvested all this information and put it into this one book. It's an awesome little book. It's easy to read. It's all in one place. So yeah, I'm very happy that somebody sent me this. Just wanted to add one more important point. If the Gospels are fiction, and clearly they're fiction, and that's all there is to base the idea that a Jesus Christ actually existed, and they're fiction. What does that tell you about the likelihood that a Jesus existed? You know? Anyway, if you've been watching, thank you. Bye!
I am absolutely convinced that the main source of hatred in the world is religion. And I think it should be religion treated with ridicule and hatred and contempt.